Now that Logan Cooley has signed, who are the other Calder Trophy hopefuls in the Western Conference? We'll discuss that, plus an update on Troy Terry's arbitration situation, and we'll rank them, the top 10 coaches in the West, all on today's episode of Locked On NHL.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
That's right. Welcome into a Tuesday edition of Locked On NHL, a Western Conference Tuesday here on Locked On NHL. Your team every day. Seth Toupal, host of Locked On Wild, joined by Nick Morgan of Locked On Predators. Nick will be our new Tuesday co-host here on Western Conference Tuesdays. We are so glad to have you along. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. If you are a first-time listener to Locked On NHL, make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platform so you don't miss out on any big news throughout the NHL. On today's episode, we'll talk Calder hopefuls as well as Troy Terry getting lowballed by the Anaheim Ducks in his arbitration situation. And we'll start a Rank 'em series as we move through the rest of the offseason, ranking today the top 10 coaches in the Western Conference. Nick, we welcome you on board for Western Conference Tuesdays. Thanks for joining us and looking forward to getting closer to the start of the regular season. How's it going?
It's going good, Seth. Channeling my inner Casablanca here and saying this feels like the beginning of a beautiful friendship. You and me holding it down on Tuesdays here on the Locked NHL podcast.
Most definitely. I can't wait for this to unfold. So let's start by looking at one of the, I think, big question marks for the Arizona Coyotes. Logan Cooley signed his ELC, and so he is now in the fold. It looked for a while like he was going to go back to the University of Minnesota. Seemed like that was pretty set in stone, and then all of a sudden, you know what? I think we're just going to go to the NHL level, and for a guy who is as talented as Cooley is, not a whole lot left to prove at the collegiate level. And so for him, I think it just is a situation where he just wants to get started with NHL life. Were you surprised after it seemed like it was pretty dead set that he was just going to go back to school? Were you pretty surprised to hear that he made the decision to forego that and head to the NHL?
No, and he's going to have a chance in Arizona to play right away and really start his career on the front foot. And I also think it helps that he's going to play probably significant minutes somewhere in that top 9 in Arizona as well. And I think that was, if you get into a situation, if you're Logan Cooley, where, maybe you're, a perennial healthy scratch, you're only playing like 10 minutes a game, then yeah, going back to Minnesota for another year, chasing a national championship, that seems appealing, but that wasn't going to be the case in Arizona. He's going to get a prime chance to jump into a meaningful role in the lineup right away and maybe get some Calder buzz, as we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, and it's funny because I think everybody assumes that one of the big front runners is Connor Bedard because Chicago doesn't have a lot in terms of skill and talent in that top 6. And so he's going to be the focal point for that group. And so in addition to Bedard, who else are we tracking as potential Calder hopefuls here for this coming season?
I mean, other than Cooley, do we say Shane Wright?
I mean, I think that'd be a good name to throw in. His season was a tumultuous one, one that saw him spend most of the season at the AHL level, then come back up. And after what we saw from Matty Beniers, you'd think that Shane Wright kind of catches on and does have a solid season here in 2023, 2024.
Yeah, it really depends on how the Kraken use him and what his use is going to be this year. Because if he gets into another situation where it's a slow start, he's, has trouble getting in, has trouble to kind of adjusting to the NHL lineup out of the gate. Maybe it's a case where he has to go back for some more seasoning. And at that point, if you're a Kraken fan, I wouldn't worry about what Shane Wright's going to be long-term. He's still a young player, still has a lot of room left to grow. But I think it's safe to say that maybe another slow start this year, maybe you're starting to think it's like, okay, maybe he's not going to be like the 130-point guy we thought he was going to be when he fell to fourth. So that to me is going to be an interesting discussion for Shane Wright. Another player, Seth, who was kind of in that same situation, another maybe Calder dark horse out of the West. How about Brandt Clark? The LA Kings. Remember, this was a guy a lot of people had penciled into the Kings lineup last year, that he made the team out of training camp. Couldn't quite stick with the team, struggled. So he went back to the juniors, went back to Barrie, and wound up having the best year of his career. Career high 61 points in 31 games, and then 23 points in 12 playoff games. He's much more confident, and LA has lost both of their Seans on defense. Sean Walker and Sean Durzi are gone. So now all of a sudden, Brandt Clark has more of a chance to kind of stick with the Kings. So there's another dark horse.
Yeah, and just looking at some of the other names that are getting mentioned, I mean, Leo Carlsson is another name kind of on the outskirts, which I think is more of a long shot, just because it's the Ducks and it's going to take them, whoever gets slotted in as a rookie, it's going to take them a little while to catch on in that group. It's a young, talented team, but I feel like Carlsson is maybe a little bit more of a long shot there. But there's some fascinating candidates throughout the Western Conference. I know there are a ton in the East as well. And so it feels like with this grouping of youngsters, it should be a pretty spirited quest for the Calder Trophy here in 2023-2024.
Yeah, in the East, there's a lot of defense, I think, to me, especially. It looks like you're going to get Hughes on New York and possibly Simon Nemec in New Jersey, and Hughes in New Jersey as well. Correction there. And you also have David Jiricek on the blue line in Columbus. He looks like he's going to be getting a chance to start with the team this year. He was a guy that a lot of people said was a top 3 defensive prospect in all of hockey. So yeah, it seems like it's funny. It's like this offensive firepower in the West, and then all of these hot young defensive prospects in the East. It's going to be kind of a fun battle.
Yeah, and if I were a betting man, I would probably throw my money on either Bedard, or maybe I would throw a little down on Logan Cooley as well. It's going to be a fascinating race to see how it plays out. And for those that are keeping an eye on it, we'll take care of some of the other things, such as arbitration, as we continue to navigate through arbitration hearings for many players in the NHL. Troy Terry had an update on his situation as he submitted his number, and well, the Ducks submitted a number themselves. So we will continue today's episode of Locked On NHL as we take a look at the numbers for Troy Terry in arbitration after this. Take your first swing at betting Major League Baseball on FanDuel and get 10 times your first bet amount in bonus bets, up to $200. That's right. Just bet $20 and you'll land $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. That's $200 you can spend betting everything from the money line to the over-under to who you think is going to hit the first home run. All on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Plus, when you win, you get paid instantly. There's no better place to bet Major League Baseball than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So sign up today and visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get up to $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official partner of Major League Baseball. Welcome back into today's episode of Locked On NHL. It is a Western Conference Tuesday, and we are glad to have you along for the ride. Seth Toupal joined by Nick Morgan. Nick, the arbitration numbers are in For Troy Terry and the Anaheim Ducks, Terry submitted $8 million, and the Ducks countered with 4.5. I know the general approach for the player is to reach as high as you can so that the arbitrator will be a little more inclined to maybe meet you higher than what the team suggests. But this is quite a disparity in terms of team and player, right? In terms of what they submitted for salaries.
I mean, you're talking to a guy whose team offered Shea Weber $3.5 million in his arbitration deal, and Weber, I think, asked for like $9 million. So, yeah, that was a fun Predator story from back in the day. I mean, look, it's a business aspect of it. We know that. But, I think it's pretty clear that we're going to get closer to the Troy Terry number out of this than we are. It's funny, Seth, because I was going back and kind of researching some of this and looking at like the analytics and stuff for Troy Terry, and this is a very underrated player. Like, I was just kind of expecting to be like, oh, just kind of, guy that gets hot every now and then, on a bad team. I mean, he's got some good point totals despite being on a very bad Ducks team. Analytically, he's like fine defensively, like not a liability anywhere. You wouldn't call him a two-way forward, but yeah, this is a guy who's kind of an underrated, really good player in the NHL. And the Ducks are in a tough situation because he's going to be an unrestricted free agent in 2 years, and they don't want this arbitration deal to be, the bridge deal to get him to free agency. They want to lock him up long term.
Yeah, and you look at the numbers too. I was fascinated by this. Troy Terry and William Nylander have played exactly 274 NHL games. Troy Terry has 75 goals, 101 assists for 176 total points. Nylander has 61 goals and 121 assists for 182 points. So the fact that their production is not that far off is just crazy to me. And they mentioned that Nylander signed for $4.5 million. And so for Troy Terry, you look at a guy who deserves a little more than I think what people would assume. And so hopefully he's able to get it. These arbitration hearings it's fascinating to follow all of them. The Wild avoided 2 this offseason, signing Brandon Duhaime before his arbitration hearing, and now signing this week, in fact, Philip Gustafsson to a deal avoiding arbitration there as well. Because a lot of times that's kind of the point of no return for player and team, is if you go to arbitration, then the player's like, well, I don't know if I'm going to stick it out and go through any sort of negotiations with you again. And so, as you said, it's a very, very tricky road for the Ducks to navigate. And so I guess we'll see how this one plays out. And, all the best to Troy Terry in this situation, because you want a player who is a little bit underrated to cash in as much as they can.
You mentioned, kind of comparable to Nylander in a way. How much money is Nylander asking the Maple Leafs for? About $10 million. Another good example, Matt Barzal just signed for what, like $9 million a year annually, big 8-year contract. He hasn't come close to the scoring that Troy Terry's put up, and he hasn't hit 60 points since 2020. So, you have, these different ways of looking at it. And that's just the contract negotiations in the NHL are, wild, because you just have, some of these underrated players, whose value you wouldn't perceive as high, getting, kind of these lowball offers, but then you compare them to, a player like Barzal or Nylander, who you would consider like high value franchise players. And you break it all down, you break down their stats and numbers, and they're not that much different. And it's weird because it's all based on perceived value. And, you kind of mentioned arbitration hearing being the point of no return. it sort of feels like that's kind of the precipice for why so many arbitration hearings go badly, or so many feelings kind of get hurt, was because, you put up all these numbers, and then you hear your team tell, an arbitrator all these reasons why you're not as valuable as you think you are. And it's just, it's kind of a weird thing, a weird dynamic in the NHL overall.
Yeah, and it really is too, that whole like, well, we think that you're valued at this number because of this, 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 this. And you, the player, being like, well, yeah, but a lot of that isn't things that I can necessarily control. So hit me at this number. So this is part of the reason you see so many arbitration situations get resolved before they even get to a hearing, because team and player are like, let's just wrap this up. So we'll see how this plays out for Troy Terry, but he's not the only one that is navigating this situation. There are plenty of players that are, but just notable that he and team were as separate as they were. So we'll monitor that. Now we're going to start what's going to become a regular segment here on Western Conference Tuesday. We're going to start ranking them in the Western Conference, and we'll start with coaches as we continue today's episode of Locked On NHL after this. Welcome back to today's episode of Locked On NHL. Thank you for tuning in each and every day to Locked On NHL. Make sure that you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platforms so you don't miss out on any new episodes on any of the most notable news happening in the NHL. Seth Toupal joined by Nick Morgan for today's Western Conference Tuesday. All right, Nick, we're going to rank them. And we're going to go with top 10 coaches in the West. Now, why top 10? Well, because there are a few coaches who are getting their first taste of coaching at the NHL level. In the case of Calgary, in the case of a couple of others as well. So we're not going to throw those coaches into the fire just yet. And there are some who are in new places. So we want to leave a little room, and then we will check back on these as the season goes on, like they do in soccer, where teams get relegated if they don't perform particularly well. This top 10 is certainly subject to change. And so, Nick, I'll have you start, and then we can discuss who made it and who didn't as we go.
Yeah. So I have Bruce Cassidy, number one, just because I feel like if you're the Stanley Cup champion, you should be recognized for being a good coach. Dave Hackstall is number two for me. We can get into the whys, I feel like, in some of these later, because I feel like you and I are both going to have some people that kind of jump out in weird places. But the rest of the top 10, I had 3 Pete DeBoer, 4 Jared Bednar, 5 Todd McClellan, 6 your boy Dean Evison, Rick Tocchet at 7, Rick Bowness at 8, Andre Tourigny at 9, and then Jay Woodcroft at 10. Because if you can't win a Stanley Cup with 2 of the best generational talents, you're probably not very high on the coaching thing.
Yeah, that's a very intriguing list to me, because mainly the thing for me is Bednar. That's about the only spot that I don't that my rankings differ, is that I would probably go Cassidy, Bednar to start off my list. But I mean, look, those top 4 guys. You've got Bruce Cassidy, who took that Vegas team to a whole new level. And that's a Vegas franchise that has been good since they came into the league. They just needed somebody to take them that next step. And Cassidy did that. They win the cup. Everybody's partying in Vegas. We're happy for you. So I have no objection to Cassidy at number 1. I go Bednar too, because that Colorado franchise, for as good as players that they have, they have had to navigate some weird injury situations over the last few years.
Fair.
So I put Bednar in there. They got the cup run finally taken care of as they slayed the Tampa Bay Lightning. I would probably go Hackstall 3. So it's not a huge difference for me. I like what Hackstall brings to the table. I think he figured out the formula for that Seattle team. And that's a group that I really don't want a lot to do with because they just seem like a complete pain to play against. I would probably then go 4 Pete DeBoer because it's the Pete DeBoer formula is well known. He takes a team to the brink of the Stanley Cup his first season that he's there. Things kind of fall off a little bit after that. And so that's the big thing for Dallas this year is does that happen again? Does that curse follow DeBoer to another new team? Or is he able to kind of shake that off? At that point, then I would probably, for the regular season success, I would probably put Dean Evison as 5. The Wild have been very good in the regular season. Postseason is a completely different story and one that a lot of Minnesota fans are irritated with. I can't blame them because, I mean, you take your pick of Minnesota teams and there just is no getting out of the first round of the playoffs, which is super annoying, and I hate it. So I'll go Dean 5. I would say McClellan probably 6 for me. Here's one I think you're going to like, just because I just like a lot of what he did with Florida. I'm putting Andrew Brunette in my top 10.
Don't hate it.
I'm going to put him at 7 because I like what he did with Florida. I think he kind of got a raw deal after they lost in the postseason. So I'm putting him in my top 10. I also am going to see, this is tough. I want to actually, I'll leave him as my first alternate. I'm going to go Rick Bowness at 8. I'll go Tocchet at 9. And then I'm going to go with, I don't want to do it, Craig Berube. I'm going to go Craig Berube at 10. And just because it's a St. Louis team that he really expects a lot out of. They didn't have a great season this past year, but I'm putting Berubes in too.
So it feels like you're going, you're adding some like historical context
A little bit
into these rankings. Okay. So backing up, Hackstall at 2, I think in terms of coming off of last season, other than Bruce Cassidy, maybe the best coaching job in all of the NHL. And I'm including Jim Montgomery, who won the Jack Adams. I'm including Lindy Ruff, who, elevated the New Jersey Devils this year. I just think you take that sort of hodgepodge team, and this wasn't like Vegas a few years ago, when they won when they got to the Cup their first year and just had like hot goaltending and 1 or 2 hot players. I mean, these were a bunch of players kind of playing average, but Dave Hackstall found a way to kind of morph them and use them in a way that they were one of the best teams in the NHL. And, as they showed in that Colorado series, wasn't a fluke. They really were a legitimate team. And I was very intrigued by the McClellan-Evison debate because I'm with you. I went back and forth with those two just because doesn't it seem like they just have 2 very similar stories? Like, inherit sort of a mess of a team, rebuild them, help elevate some players, have really strong regular seasons, but just cannot find a way to win a playoff series.
Yeah, and they're very much set in like, this is how we do it. This is how we do it. And if you're good enough to beat us, then we tip our caps. But there's not going to be a lot in the way of like tinkering and adjustments. It's pretty much what you see is what you get.
And it works. Like they're somebody's going to win a playoff series at some point. I was happy we both included Tocchet. Because remember when he got named head coach last year, like mid-season, There's a lot of people not happy with that move. They're like, oh, it's just, sort of a retread name, hashtag grit, hashtag, locker room, culture, all this and that, sort of this old school hire. He found a way to make that Canucks team really good at the end of the year. Remember, they were a team like back around Christmas, strong contenders in the Connor Bedard sweepstakes.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, I can't remember exactly where. I think they were maybe like 6 points out of a playoff spot, but they fought all their way back into being in the playoff conversation by the end of the year. And, just how talented that Vancouver team is with the young talent. I think they can be a playoff team this year. And I think you got to give Rick Tocchet some credit for that.
Yeah, and he may have solved or helped solve one of the biggest riddles for that Vancouver squad, which is Thatcher Demko. He was great down the stretch, and I know he was injured at the beginning of the season, but it seems like a situation where maybe coach just reaffirms some of that support for a goalie and is able to get more out of him. So yeah, I liked what Tocchet did for Vancouver. It was a mess before he got there. And it certainly seems like he helped right things a little bit. But as I said, we will play these out as the season goes, and we'll relegate people as needed out of the top 10, depending on how things are going. But there's a lot of solid coaching in the Western Conference. There are some teams that are hoping that they've found the next Jared Bednar or Bruce Cassidy or somewhere along those lines. And this is one of the things that we get a chance to do, is just seeing it play out. And everybody hopes that that their guy is the next one hoisting the cup.
Andrew Burnett, if you're listening to this, we hope you're the next guy to lift the Stanley Cup.
Well, that is, I think, going to wrap it up for today's episode of Locked On NHL, a Western Conference Tuesday. Nick, before we sign off, let the folks know where they can follow you as well as Locked On Predators if they are curious for more as we get closer to the start of the season.
Yeah, you can listen to Locked On Predators every day, wherever you get your podcast, Spotify, Apple, Stitcher, all that good stuff. Also on YouTube. You can find me on X, as we're calling it now, I guess, at _NS Morgan to see all of my written articles I put out through the week as well.
And make sure that you follow Locked On Wild on all of your favorite social media platforms, including X. You can also follow me on X at Seth Toups. Thanks for tuning in once again to Western Conference Tuesday. For more, make sure that you follow and subscribe to Locked On NHL wherever you listen to your podcasts.